Yeah, now we're gonna kind of get into the details, the nitty-gritty of HIV criminalization. Next slide, please. So just like a little overview of HIV criminalization, HIV criminalization is a racial, gender, and economic justice issue. It does disproportionately affect Black, Indigenous, other people of color, trans women, sex workers, and all those other groups listed in the slide. For example, in terms of, my home state of Tennessee, has a sex offender registration requirement if you are convicted under Tennessee's HIV criminalization statute. And of the people living with HIV who are on the sex offender registry in Tennessee, 3/4 of them are Black. And of course, that's no coincidence. That's mostly due to over-policing and surveillance, state-sanctioned violence, white supremacy. All of those things are contributing to this kind of is contributing to allowing HIV criminalization to continue to fester and target certain folks more disproportionately. Criminalization also kind of has an increase for risk of violence for women living with HIV. So in terms of cis and transgender women living with HIV, they kind of get stuck in this cycle of violence. So if they don't disclose to their partner, then that could put them at risk of violence. But if they do disclose, if they do disclose, then that could put them at risk of violence to their partner. If they don't disclose, that could put them at risk of being criminalized and all the consequences that come with that. And oftentimes, for cis and trans women living with HIV, their partners can use like this threat of HIV criminalization as kind of a way to control them and continue to kind of oppress them. So kind of that, like, if you leave, then I'll like tell the police that you are living with HIV and that you didn't tell me, like something like that. So it just kind of creates this dual wave of state-based violence in terms of the criminalization from the state in terms of the prosecution and conviction, as well as this interpersonal violence, this threat of interpersonal violence from a potential partner. And we know that criminalization has, longstanding consequences. Incarceration and criminal records can really affect someone's daily life. The person could lose their right to vote. They could lose their house if they've been incarcerated. They could lose their children if they're also now incarcerated because of this conviction. So it has like really long-standing consequences. Next slide, please. And so what you're seeing here is just a map, courtesy of the Center for HIV Law and Policy, of HIV criminalization in the US. So as you can see, there are HIV-specific criminalization statutes, as well as states that just use general, non-specific HIV statutes to criminalize folks. So as you can kind of see here, most states have one or the other or are using both. And some states, like I mentioned, like my home state of Tennessee, they have sex offender registration requirements for their HIV criminalization laws as well. And I guess what's not depicted here in this map is that the usage of federal laws in terms of HIV criminalization. So for example, if you're a person living with HIV serving within the military, or if you're a person living with HIV, you can't serve in the military under federal law under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But if you are a person living with HIV and let's say you find out like later after you've already enlisted, then they can't kick you out or anything like that as long as you still meet the fitness standards for duty. As well as the federal laws prohibit the donation or sale of blood, semen, tissues, organs, or other bodily fluids for people living with HIV. So there are these like federal implications as well to HIV criminalization, not just states. Next slide, please. And I'd be remiss if we didn't discuss HIV criminalization with an intersectional lens. So we know that oftentimes states have sentence enhancements for people living with HIV who engage in sex work. And the results of that those sentencing enhancements tends to be that the enforcement around those enhancements end up targeting Black folks, trans folks disproportionately, as well as another intersection is for people who use drugs. They are often criminalized, and that kind of results in the deterring of harm reduction practices such as safe syringe programs, and it increases stigma so that people who use drugs are less likely to seek testing or treatment for their diagnosis for fear of legal consequences. So there's a lot of intersections, but those are just two big ones. Next slide. And there is so much more that Congress could be doing. And one person who is doing a lot more in Congress is Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and we're going to hear some remarks from her.
Hello, everyone. I am Congresswoman Barbara Lee, proudly representing the 13th Congressional District of California, which includes Oakland and Berkeley, California. I would like to thank all of the members of the HIV community and its allies here today for your strong advocacy as we work to eradicate HIV and AIDS altogether. 40 years into this epidemic, people with HIV are living longer than ever, and the rate of diagnoses has decreased due to domestic programs like the Ryan White and the Minority AIDS Initiative. But we still have so much work to do. We will only end this disease when we address the deep disparities in access to healthcare and prevention services and the underlying systemic barriers, including pervasive stigma and discrimination. It is unconscionable that dangerous and stigmatizing laws still exist in 31 states and 2 U.S. territories. These laws undermine public health and contribute to worsening the HIV epidemic. These laws and policies are one of the primary reasons why people living with HIV do not seek medical care. We cannot achieve our shared goal of achieving an AIDS-free generation while these laws are on the books. That is why, with my fellow co-chair of the bipartisan and bicameral Congressional HIV/AIDS Caucus, Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, we have reintroduced H.R. 6111, the repeal existing policies that encourage and allow legal Hiv Discrimination Act of 2022. This bill addresses the serious ongoing problem of discrimination in the use of criminal and civil commitment laws against those who test positive for HIV at the federal and state levels. As some of you may know, I have been a fierce advocate for ending HIV and ensuring an AIDS-free generation since my time in the California legislature since the 1990s. As a member of Congress, I authored or co-authored every piece of HIV/AIDS legislation, including the legislative frameworks for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, that's PEPFAR, and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, that's the Global Fund. I'm calling on all of you to join me and encourage others to join this battle to HIV discrimination. Together, we can realize the first ever HIV and AIDS-free generation. Thank you so much, and keep up the fight.
I know she's not here with us, but please show some love to Barbara Lee in the chat. She's been a champion for ending HIV criminalization for a long time. Thank you so much for what you do, Congresswoman Lee. So yeah, now we're gonna get to why we are here today to discuss the Repeal Hiv Discrimination Act, which, as Congresswoman Lee noted in the video, she has just reintroduced in 2022. It's HR 6111, and she first introduced it in 2011, so it's kind of been just languishing in the House for a long time. It's never been introduced in the Senate. It would basically next slide, please. It kind of would create this 4-step process. So first, agencies would work together to just review the federal and state laws that are both criminal and civil around HIV criminalization, and that would include the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is good. And this process of review would happen in consultation with people living with HIV, so they would be meaningfully involved in this process. The second step would be for to take all this review and turn it into a report that would be publicly accessible, which would detail the findings of those reviews of the various federal and state HIV laws and policies. The third step, which would be through ONAP, which would release, or ONAP would release a set of public guidelines and guidance for states to use when engaging in these when in their quest to end HIV criminalization in their states. It would provide this guidance. And fourth and finally, it would create some accountability measures for the states who are kind of deciding to go through this process of modernizing or repealing their HIV criminalization laws. It would provide some accountability measures to see how they're doing and keep them in check. Next slide, please. So just, out of transparency, the Repeal Act, it's not enough. It's basically just a step in the right direction. It would not force states to repeal or modernize their HIV criminalization laws. It would not force states to stop prosecuting people living with HIV under general criminal statutes either, but it would be a step in the right direction. And short of, tying money or tempting states with money, for example, to repeal or modernize their laws, this is kind of the next best thing. Next slide, please. And, the Repeal Act would mean a lot for people living with HIV. It would acknowledge the past harm that HIV criminalization has caused. It would kind of create a bunch of kind of documentation of HIV criminalization in the various states, and through these reports and the guidance and proposals and whatnot. It would also create a space for the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV in a federal space, which is not something that often happens since most discussions on HIV criminalization are state-based. And it would give advocates and states more tools to fight HIV criminalization in their own states as well.